you everybody for coming to this session. Just as people just come in and take your seats, we're really delighted to be welcoming you here, and we are so happy to be hosting this session at Stand Up to Racism at the summit against fighting racism and fighting the far right. This session is on Here to Stay, Here to Fight, Asian Fight Back in Britain. And we're going to be having a conversation about this topic. And just by way of some introductions, my name's Esme. I've been an anti-racist activist for many years and in different cities. Most recently, I was involved with Stand Up to Racism in Walthamstow in northeast London, where over 7,000 people turned out in August to see off a threat from the far right. We had an amazing, it was, one of the best days of Waltham Forest. But not the first time that Waltham Forest has decisively seen off the far right. We had our big protests in 2012, but I've been an activist much longer than that. I grew up in Bradford as actually the only Asian family on my street, on the outskirts of Bradford, where actually my formative experiences of racist violence against myself and against my family also made me determined to change that, not just for myself, but for other people. And I've campaigned against racism in many different cities. I was in Birmingham for a long time. I've been in Manchester, Scotland, and now I'm a health worker in London with a special interest in combating health inequalities as part of my my mission, if you like. So anyway, enough about me. I'd like to introduce these my colleagues here, who I'm really delighted to be in conversation with today. We have Mukhtar Dar. Mukhtar, many of you will know, is an artist and an activist with a long history of grassroots organising. He co-founded the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement in 1982. He later joined the Birmingham Asian Youth Movement and the Pakistani Workers Association. He has also played a key role in establishing the Manchester Black People's Alliance and the Birmingham South Asian Alliance, and more recently co-founded the King's Heath United Against Racism in response to a local Islamophobic attack. Following the far-right racist riots in August 2024, he co-launched Asian Defiance, a national anti-racist, anti-fascist movement dedicated to uniting South Asian communities against state racism and fascism, and contributing to a national united front against the far right. So a very busy man. So we're delighted that he's joined us here today. And then we also have with us today is Taj Ali. And Taj is a journalist and historian. Many of you will have read some of his work. His work has appeared in the Huffington Post, the Metro, and the Independent. He's the former editor of Tribune magazine, and he's currently writing a book on the history of British South Asian political activism in the UK. And we've just been chatting about it. I think we're all really excited about this book that should be out hopefully next year. So the way we're going to run this is the beginning of this session is going to be a conversation. In fact, I'm going to come and sit a bit nearer because it's a bit of a weird conversation at a distance. I don't know how other people have conversations. So the beginning of this session will be a conversation, but then we're going to open the conversation and involve you in the conversation as well. So we're going to start with a few questions, dialogue between ourselves, see how that flows, and then we will open it up for questions, thoughts, ideas from yourselves, and obviously, like as in all our sessions, our special guests will get to have the final say at the end of the meeting. Thank you very much. And I guess one of the reasons we're having this session is there are some pretty bleak things going on in the world today. We've talked a lot today about Trump, but the general political ascendancy of the far right in many places, I think, makes it so important that we capture some of the actual brilliant traditions of struggle, of resistance. And I think the Defiance films that were shown on Channel 4 earlier this year brought to a much wider audience some of the history of Asian struggles against the far right in Britain, in particular in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And I really want to start by inviting Mukhtar to tell us a bit more about this, because obviously he was living this history. And Mukhtar, can you tell us something about your experiences of racism around this time and how you came to found the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement?
So I'd like to first of all thank Stand Up to Racism for inviting me to speak at the summit, which I think you all agree is very important, very timely, given the challenges that we're facing with the growth of the far right and also the onslaught of state racism. Uh, I am a bit clogged up with cold. Also, last night in Birmingham, we had an event that we have every month called Kings Eats United Against Racism. We do an event called Collab Lounge, which finished at 3 o'clock, and I shouldn't have been there. So anyway, so bear with me. I will try to remain focused and collect my thoughts to answer your questions. So yeah, the how I got involved is that my father came to this country like most people from the former colonies, supply of cheap labor, and he settled in the steel city of Sheffield. He worked in the foundries and the factories, and that's the city that I later joined in with my mother. I grew up in Sheffield. My early childhood experience was very positive, but then in the 80s, late 70s, the 80s, Britain was in a deep recession. Thatcher had come into power, and there was her speech, if you remember, just like the politicians today, talk about stopping the boats. Back then, it was about Britain being swamped. And Sheffield, with the steel city, it really, under monetarism, under Thatcher's new policies, under that recession, it really became a decimated city. The foundries and factories began to close, due to the competition, due to things moving abroad, and really that led to a climate in which there was escalating poverty and divisions began to emerge. And the politicians, our slogan back then as the Asian Youth Movement was Labour, Tory, both the same, both played the racist game. So there was very little difference. Both parties back then, as they do today, represented the interests of the British ruling elite. And so we, Asians and Afro-Caribbeans, under the recession, became the convenient scapegoats. We were the ones that were targeted. And what that did was also similar to today. Out of the gutters emerged the far right, making opportunities use of that climate, which is what fashion, the way most people know, that's how fascism grows. But back then, we had the National Front, and the National Front began to gain electoral support. They stood candidates, and there are some comrades here from Sheffield. I live in Birmingham now, but there was the National Front stood candidates in Hillsborough. And at the time, I think they really began to increase their electoral support. And if I remember correctly, they had something like 300 candidates standing in the elections. But then we were also plagued by paramilitary fascist organizations like the British Movement, Combat 18, and swastikas, racist graffiti began to appear on our walls, on our doors, and really it was very much siege conditions. Our places, our homes were being attacked, our places of worship were being petrol bombed, and the police who were supposedly there to protect us were either indifferent or they colluded and connived. And invariably, when we defended our communities, it was we who was arrested by the police, taken to the police stations, and also we had a mounting toll of people dying in police custody. In that kind of climate, in Sheffield, what happened was that what led to the Asian Youth Movement, the AYMs were defensive organizations that came about in response to, as I say, state racism, but also the escalating fascist violence that was taking place. So in Sheffield, what happened was that in Darnell, an area which is predominantly composed of South Asian communities, there was a restaurant called the Shazan restaurant. 14 racists went to that restaurant, they had the food, after which they shouted racist abuse. They told the waiters that they were Pakis and that they had no right to be in this country and that the food should be given to them free of charge because they were subservient. They then smashed the plates, turned the tables, went outside. Nearby a waste ground, they picked up the bricks and they smashed all the windows and they beat up the waiters. The manager, Ahmed Khan, called the police. The police was only something like 10, 15 minutes drive from the restaurant. It took the police over an hour to arrive. And lo and behold, when they arrived, it was the waiters, who had been beaten up, the victim of the assault who were arrested, taken to the police station, charged with assault, and they were also charged with nicking their own money from the till, whilst the racists walked away scot-free. When the news spread to our community, the next day, the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement came into being. This was the reality up and down the country. In 81, there was something like 26 racist murders, and our back was up against the wall, and we had no choice but to organize to defend ourselves and our community. The Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, I left home because I did not want any repercussions of my political activity on my parents. I moved into a house which was called the bus shelter. And the bus shelter was a code name for the place in Pittsmore where one of our comrades, he owned the house. And in the basement, we had training facilities. And upstairs, we had an office. We were in our teens, we were in our early 20s. We systematically collated. We used our dole money and our student grants, and we purchased books, which we shared. We bought newspapers, we took cuttings, and we subscribed to magazines, international, like India Today, and we had a very thick folder called the Fascist File. We knew where they lived, we knew who they were, what the numbers were, and we monitored them, and whenever the need arose, we also dealt with them. So I think just to capture the atmosphere for you, and I'll finish at this, it's just we used to chant at night in this bus shelter. We used to get together around a fire in the winter, and we used to chant lyrics, just express how we felt to each other, share each other's pain. He who knows it feels it. So I just want to share with you something that I wrote back then, which hopefully will give you a sense of the atmosphere. To this country they brought us. In their ghettos they placed us. Within their factories they enslaved us. For all of their problems they blamed us. Now we come of the age when we can no longer control this year age. No equal ops, no begging bowl, no larger slice of their rotten cake can keep us in a this year cage. For we are the seeds of this year's system's destruction. We possess the power to paralyze production. Antwerp and Brixton, mashing up the system of oppression. For far too long we've been on our knees. Stand up, stand up, stand up on your feet. No matter what the wicked one says, no matter what the government does, come what may, we are here to stay and here to fight for our rights. In 1981, the ghettos uprise. The message is clear. The petrol bombs fly and ignite the night sky. The message is clear. We will not live in fear. We will agitate, organize, and mobilize and fight. Try to remember the other line. Jinnah samundru pair uthaaye, lakh lakh musibatan chaliyan. Those who stepped across the sea spent their lives in misery. Unna is mulk da loa chaya. Hun parsina pasaya. They lifted the toil, the iron of this country. They sweated and toiled. Naam badnaam inna karaya. They're the ones that named and blamed and shamed us. Itthe ladange, jit ke rahenge, itthe revange. So this was a language of struggle. So we used to say and articulate.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And I just want to move to Taj, really, because obviously the history we've heard has to be understood or seen maybe in the context of wider history of South Asian struggles, living and organising in Britain. And I wondered if you could just tell us some more about that.
Can everyone hear me okay? Fantastic. Just following on from that really powerful contribution from Mukhtar Dar, the passion in his voice, the poetry, the links to colonialism. I think all of these things are features of South Asian political activism in Britain. And I think it's important, firstly, to recognize that South Asians have been present in Britain for over 400 years. there's a tendency to think of the South Asian presence emerging after the Second World War. That was, of course, when we had much larger South Asian communities. But actually, we had many South Asians arriving in this country in the early 1800s. They were known as the Lascars, the seafarers who worked on the British ships. They were exploited on these ships. They were seen through the colonial stereotype that because they came from the warmer countries, they could work on the steamships and power them with the coal. And many of them were exploited within the subcontinent as well by a group known as the Sarangs, who were the middlemen, the intermediaries. We still have intermediaries in Britain today. And I think it's important to recognize that the struggle of South Asians wasn't just a struggle against white power structures. It was often a struggle within the communities. And that's a parallel that we see throughout that history of organizing today here in Britain, over there in the Indian subcontinent, when you had zamindars, who were the landowners exploiting the peasantry. And that experience of colonial rule would often mean that South Asians would look for jobs elsewhere. So you had the history of the indentured servitude, where you had South Asians literally working as servants in places like Mauritius, in the sugar colonies, in the West Indies, in South Africa, in East Africa as well. And that's why it wasn't surprising for South Asians to migrate to different parts of the world. In America, in the Pacific coast, we had a group known as the Ghadar movement, which was set up in 1913. And this was a group of Punjabi Sikh farmers who worked as lumberjacks. So they faced racism in the United States. They were also well aware of the brutality of colonialism. Many of them had great-grandparents who fought in the 1857 uprising against British rule. So they had this understanding of how oppressive colonial rule was, and they were organizing and agitating, often through violent means, often through armed struggle for independence. And that movement in America had links to the international workers of the world, the Wobblies, where they would often be surrounded in the logging camps and they would talk about these struggles. The irony of colonialism was it was actually easier to organize against colonialism in the heart of empire because you would face repression in the colonies. And we often saw different ideas, a cross-fertilization of ideas. In Britain, we had Indian students arriving in the early 20th century. And there was a man called Shyamji Krishna Varma, who was a lawyer, who was an anti-colonialist. He married into a very wealthy family. And he brought a house in Highgate, North London, and it was named India House. And he said to the students who were in India, I will give you scholarships on the basis that you refuse to work for the British. So we had a group of Indian students in Britain in 1905 in North London who were learning the history of colonialism, who were interacting with Irish Republicans. It said that Lenin visited this house in 1905. And so they had this class consciousness, they had this understanding of colonial rule. They were doing arms smuggling. In the garden, they were doing bomb-making workshops. They were doing shooter training in Tottenham Court Road. And this is a hidden history of South Asians in Britain. The reason I know this history is because the British state spied on these students. If you go to the British Library, we have the India Office records, and the Brits would spy upon these Indian students because they were worried after seeing the Russian Revolution that perhaps there could be a movement for independence in the colonies. And no doubt many of those South Asians were inspired by the Russian Revolution. They'd also seen Japan beat Russia and thought maybe Asian nations can rise up. So that's that broader history of anti-colonialism. We start to see a significant increase in seafarers towards the 1930s, in between the wars. And South Asians develop a presence in many of the port cities in Liverpool, in Cardiff, in Glasgow, in the South Shields. And they are working class, but they are more than just working class. They are the underclass who the trade unions fail to represent. In the aftermath of the First World War, we have the Trades Union Congress, the building we're sitting in right now, the TUC. They had motions condemning Asiatic labor. And so even though South Asians had a class consciousness and saw the white poor in Britain and recognized who the real oppressor was, there was still a great hostility from the trade union movement. And it was that hostility that led to South Asians organizing for themselves. So in 1938, we have the emergence of the Indian Workers Association in Coventry. And it primarily consisted of Punjabi peddlers who were selling goods door to door. They were campaigning for independence, but they also, again, saw themselves as part of a broader movement. And actually, you can find photos from 1942 of Punjabi Sikhs in Coventry at the May Day marches. Because even if some in the trade unions never sought to involve them in the movement, they saw their struggle as part of that global international struggle. So we have the Indian Workers Association, and of course, one of the most famous examples of someone associated with them was Udham Singh. Udham Singh was a man who had seen the Amritsar massacre in India, and he assassinated a governor from the Punjab, Odwaya. And in many Punjabi Sikh communities in Southall, when they arrived after the Second World War, they had portraits of Udham Singh. And my point is, people had learned from those who came before them. The anti-racist struggles, the anti-imperialist struggles didn't come out of nowhere. Many of those involved in the Indian Workers Association were members of communist parties back home in India, and they brought the politics with them. Many of them were involved in strikes and boycotts against British rule. They had parents involved in the anti-colonial struggles. In the 1960s, in parts of Southall, half the Punjabis were members of the Indian Workers Association. And I think it's important to recognize that you had communal living at the time because of housing discrimination. You could have 20 people in a 3-bedroom house. That was my dad's experience. You would take shifts on beds. You'd work the worst jobs in the factories, the mills, and the foundries. The capitalists often had the most unproductive parts of the factory, utilizing South Asian labor because they saw them as docile. And that experience of racism in housing, racism in the factories, the failure of trade unions to represent them meant they relied on the community, the mosques, the gurdwaras, the temples, the kinship networks to support them. And we did see many industrial disputes in the 1960s. We had the Wool's rubber factory strike in 1965 in Southall involving South Asians. The Indian Workers Association went to recruit for the TGW, the Transport and General Workers Union, which is now known as Unite, to try and unionize. The union failed to represent them. They still fought. And of course, we also had in Preston, the Red Scar Mill strike. Many of these strikes were lost ultimately because the trade unions failed to represent them. And then we have South Asians arriving from East Africa in the 1970s. And again, just like today, where we have the newspapers having this hostility around, stop the boats and all the rest of it, you had people talking about invasion and migrants coming. And so you had the racist hostility towards many of these migrants who were actually middle class in East Africa. They were the intermediaries. They often had a bit more wealth than the black Africans. But when they arrived here in Britain, their qualifications weren't recognized. Their wealth wasn't recognized. They were working class. And so the South Asians always had that connection to the working class. And we have many examples of South Asians. I don't have much time to go through all the details, but the Imperial Typewriters strike in 1974 in Leicester, where you had the community supporting them. And of course, the most famous one, the Brunwick strike. And Jayabin Desai, one of the leaders of that strike at the film processing factory. Sorry, I'm running out of time, but just to share a quick quote from her, because I think it really captures the spirit from these women. She said, the factory boss said, "You're like monkeys," a comparison to animals. And she said, what you're running here is not a factory, it's a zoo. And there's different kinds of animals in a zoo. There's some monkeys that will dance on your fingertips. There are others who are lions and they'll bite your head off. We are the lions, Mr. Manager. And that is the pretext. That is the pretext to a lot of what Mukhtar Dar has very eloquently explained, that we have a very rich and proud history of organizing, and it's a lot that we can learn from. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's really interesting that you say that discussion about the working class movement and the trade union movement in Britain, because the fact that we're meeting here in Congress House itself says something to me about the transformation that has taken place in our trade union movements. We expect all our trade unions to be anti-racist today. Many trade unions have sponsored this event, but this was not inevitable. And it was the struggle of the Asian workers themselves and black workers. But I think particularly that's that history that you talk about of Asian workers having to fight against their own trade union representatives, sometimes against the reactionary and racist elements in their workplaces, as well as against their bosses, that has absolutely transformed the trade union movement. And I think in particular, Grunwick's as you talk about, was the first time that there was actually one of the strikes led by Asian workers broke through into mass solidarity in the wider working class and has helped to transform. So it's the struggles themselves that have transformed our trade union movement. And I think the other thing that I really was thinking about when you were talking is about the role of Asian women in many of those strikes, because many of those the new migrants to Britain were the Asian women who came, who then had to make a new life, who were then working in conditions that were really intolerable. And actually, there is a stereotype of Asian women, isn't there, that we're meek and submissive. And these have been long enduring stereotypes, which I think have been absolutely smashed through the activism of Asian women themselves, not just in the Grunwick's dispute, but in a whole series of disputes that took place in the 1960s and the 1970s, led by Asian women workers. But you only have to look again today to who is leading the struggles against Islamophobia. Often it's the Muslim women who are at the forefront of many of the struggles that we're all part of today. So we're also a very rich part of the struggle. But I know we're short on time, but I did want to continue in this theme of Asians and the working class struggle. To just, I know that both of you have written or been involved in some of the solidarity between Asian workers or Asian youth movements and the miners. And we are on the 40th anniversary of the Great Miners' Strike in Britain. So while we're on the theme of trade unions, I wondered if, I know, Taj, that you've written about this, and I know, Mukhtar, you've been involved in this. I don't know if either of you can, or both of you would like to contribute to some discussion about this, because I think this is a real case of hidden history in the working class in Britain. Either both.
Well, I'll just talk about what led us to the miners' picket lines in Sheffield, nearby stone throw where it was Albury. So at the time, racism is not only a tool that seeks to divide the working classes, it's also the way our people were brought here to be exploited to extract a greater surplus and put into foundries and factories. And as I talked earlier about the recession, so what happened was that in Sharrow Lane, the neighborhood that I lived in, there was a bookshop, a Rastafarian bookshop called the I&I Bookshop. And it was attacked by skinheads, and they smashed all the windows and they put swastikas over it. And at the same time, they went with iron bars and attacked a Bangladeshi member of our community. And we visited that member of the community, and I can just see the kids upstairs leaning down with their father's head bleeding, and they were terrified. And when we looked at them, that was a member of our community. It could have been our parents. It was an attack upon the whole community, and it had been happening to that family. So what we said is that we were going to stay on that house, and we were going to prepare to defend that family. And we had a campaign. We had a strategy of community defense. We went around, knocked on door to door. We found out the balance of forces, who was prepared to come out, who was not. We set up telephone trees for mobile times, right? So when we were ready, we then isolated the racists. We put out a call that we were going to defend this family, and this family had been attacked, and the councillors, the police had done nothing. Anyway, in that context, the media put out billboards saying Asian vigilantes take to the streets. Out of that necessity, we had no choice but to build alliances. We're minorities. And we understood, we were young, that actually, all it required was the clubs and the pubs to empty and for the people to walk down into our community, and we would be outnumbered. So in that reality, we went to the miners' picket lines. And I remember Taj put this in one of his articles. We took a minibus, and in the early hours, we were going around picking for our members. And I remember throwing some pebbles at a window. And I woke one of our members up and got him in the back of the minibus and wiped his sleepy eyes. We get to Albury on the miners' picket line, and one of the miners turned around and saw us, and he turned, "What the hell are the packies doing here?" So the young lad who had woken up turned around to me and said to me, "Yo, bro, you wake me up at 7 in the morning, right? And I get this shit." And I said, "Well, we can see the bars and they can't." And that was the same day that the Battle of Albury took place. And when the police charged, we pelted it as well, and we ran over the bushes and hid and all this stuff, right? So we built unity in struggle. We challenged each other's prejudices. We went to the miners' halls. We were inspired. The same hatred that we had for the police, with the same hatred that we saw in their eyes. The miners were fighting for their livelihood, for their way of life, their community, just as we were defending. And all of these came together. One evening, long story, but we got attacked in a pub. And we went back to that pub, we tooled up. And I won't tell you what happened after. But anyway, the thing is that the vans that came back in Sheffield, our van was smashed to glass, right? And we had petrol bombs in there. We end up in this roundabout, and as we're going round the roundabout, there are Black Mariahs in front of us, and the Black Mariahs behind us, and jazz playing, very surreal in the thing. We were off to the hospital because glass had gone to my eye. And one of my pally, whose brother had been killed by the National Front in Coventry, was one of our members who was in the van. He lost it because he remembered his brother, and his neck had been cut by this whole pub came out with bottles and stuff. Anyway, the thing is, the vans that were there, they were the vans that were coming back from the old picket line, and we were ready for a riot. That what had happened to us. So, the thing is that in the inner city, the miners, the struggle of we'd exploded in 81, 85, the hunger strikes that were taking place in Northern Ireland, the women were marching to reclaim the night because Yorkshire Ripper was on the roof. So all of these things came together in order to create unity and solidarity. We understood that our oppression was connected. We understood the need for alliance. And in struggle, we seek to build unity. And that is exactly the challenge we face now. We understood as young people that we had to build a united front, a broad alliance. We had our specific oppression, but also we came from a class, and we had class instinct and class consciousness. So we systematically went out to build unity with the labor trade union movement. We learned from the left. We were left-leaning. We were anti-imperialist. We understood colonialism, and colonialism was a living phenomenon. That's why our people come here. And we had three pillars. One was the struggle here, two was the struggle back home, and the third struggle that we were part of international oppressed people, and we had to come together in order to. So that is the important line.
Thank you. And although we're short on time, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this, Taj. I know you've written about this.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and keep it very brief. I mean, the example that Mukhtar cites in Orgreave, and I think the class consciousness of saying we can see the bars and they can't is quite powerful. And I often quote that story when I talk to trade unionists and miners about collectivism and the principle of an injury to one is an injury to all. The miners' strike in '84, there were very few South Asians who worked in the mines. But again, as Mukhtar said, they saw themselves as part of a broader working class. And many of the miners I interviewed for my article this was the first time they were really interacting with Black and Asian people during the miners' strike. We know stories of Black people support the miners groups in London going up to the picket lines in Wales. And there's a story of one of the miners' wives who had racist views, who believed what she read in the papers, who ended up dancing with Black and Asian people who'd been supporting her on the picket line and really understanding that the struggles are similar. I think the other key thing to remember is, the National Union of Mine Workers and Arthur Scargill were there at Grunwick, and the South Asians remembered the solidarity of the broader working class. I know stories, for instance, of miners groups squabbling over who would get the support and donations in Birmingham, in Handsworth, very poor Black and Asian community. They would often generate the most amount of money, the most amount of food. And in the Indian Workers Association, they were predominantly Punjabi Sikhs, and they had the principle of langar, which is the idea of we share food with others. And they fed so many miners, and many of the miners I speak to say that solidarity kept them going. Many of the members of the Indian Workers Association would turn up in support of the miners on the picket lines. They would raise funding for them. And one of the stories I want to share before I finish is actually in Lee Hall in the Midlands. This was a place where quite a few of the miners didn't go on strike. You had quite a bit of scabbing. And so they needed broader support to sustain them. And many of the Indian Workers Association did support them. The Birmingham folks supported them. At the same time, there was a strike involving South Asian women against a South Asian boss in Birmingham, Kewell Brothers, in 1984. And the Lee Hall miners, who had no money at all, who were really struggling, they remember that solidarity, and they sent 2 minibuses up to Birmingham in solidarity with the South Asian women. So South Asian women up against a exploitative South Asian employer paying them £1, or however much it was like a sweatshop, and white workers going up against white bosses and, you know, a white government. And I think that's really, really important to understand how class consciousness brought these different communities together. And I think in the age of identity politics, where we forget the importance of coalition building and community organizing, that is what the solidarity of the miners' strike teaches us.
Thank you both. Now, I know you're both really keen to bring this up to date with some thoughts about today. I don't know if you're happy for us to take some questions first, and then we'll bring it, make some remarks, or is that okay with yourselves? I just want to make sure that some people get to ask some questions, make some comments, make some points from the floor. So I guess we'll just take a show of hands if people have got things that they want to say, comments that they want to make, particularly questions. I'm going to just pop your hands up. I'm just going to ask the person at the back with the hat on and the glasses, if you'd like to try and keep it as short as you can, just so we can get more people.
Yeah, I think the contribution from the platform were very informative. I mean, I came to this country in 1963. Wasn't one of the early generations, because my forefathers came to Britain, I think, very early. I think something like 1919, 1920. And of course, I remember, I mean, one interesting point you might not know, Udham Singh, who came here, was part of what is now known as Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara. Originally, I think the Gurdwara was in Camden. And then I have an original photo of Udham Singh with the Sikhs here. And I remember the struggle of the Indian Workers Association and obviously Grunwick, because I'll only live a couple of miles from Grunwick. And I was on the picket line at Grunwick, and we done collection for Grunwick. At that time, I used to work for Ford Motor Company. I was a shop steward there. Interesting enough, not only we were discriminated and all the things about packies and all of that I experienced in my younger days. So we had that kind of nonsense going on then. But the discrimination was also against the women, and not only at Grunwick, but the white women in factories like Trico. And that was for equal pay, because men were getting higher pay and the women were on a lower pay, doing exactly the same job, and they were on strike for a long period of time before they actually won. And they were member of the AUW, and I was member of the Transport and General Worker Union at the time. So, you know, in those days, 70s, mid-70s, the Indian Workers Association was strong. And where there was a large Asian community, we used to just walk out. And the Gurdwara used to organize coaches for anti-racist struggle all over the country. So, I mean, now you have a different generation, but it's important to remember the history. The other history that imperialism caused us was in India subcontinent, where we were divided, Hindus and Sikhs and Muslim, and we have they created Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. But Pakistan, when I come from the area which is Punjab, they divided Punjab into two sections. 60% is now in Pakistan, and our capital of whole of Punjab was Lahore. And
Can I just ask you to sum up if that's
40% were in the Indian areas. And I think there's a lot of common interest with the Muslim people from Lahore and the Sikhs from Sikh side of Punjab, Amritsar and Ludhiana. I'm from Ludhiana. Now, all I'm saying is there's always divisions created by society, whether it's colonialism or imperialism or racism. And I think racism can be the other way, not the blacks against the white, and it could be the other way as well. So we have to fight against all form of racism. And thanks
Thank
very
you.
much for speakers for the excellent contributions.
Thank you very much. But yourself, yep. Is the mic, can we bring the mic down here? And then in the second row will be the next person.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on what, you know, the speakers were saying about unity and how important that is, you know, when we're fighting against racism in South Asian communities and otherwise. And I think that over the summer, I think we saw the importance of unity, but also, you know, in the 1970s and the 1980s, you know, when Taj Ali, you know, was killed, and, you know, the Bengali men, yes, they were at the front of those marches, but they were holding socialist worker placards, or they were holding other community, you know, placards, and there were other communities that were involved. And there are fracturings within our own communities. Like when I was out on the streets all summer, you know, with, you know, my friends in BLM and Stand Up to Racism, my family were telling me, you know, go home, they're gonna, you know, you're gonna get hurt, you're gonna get in trouble. But I think that it's really important that we push back against those ideas, and we, you know, talk to our own communities, and we build unity, and we say that actually there's safety in numbers, and there's safety when we link up with, you know, other groups, when we link up with the Palestine, you know, movement, when we link up with BLM, when we link up with other struggles. And I think that, you know, it's just so important to make sure that there is that safety in numbers, and, you know, we join things like Stand Up to Racism and keep building and keep fighting racism on our streets. So, you know, that these, you know, what happened in the summer can't happen again, what happened in the 70s and the 80s can't happen again. And, you know, we have a really strong street movement. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. So down here in the second row, and then at the back in the red hoodie. And people should feel free to just ask questions as well if they want to ask any questions while we've got these amazing speakers here. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, like I've been involved the last few years of trying to build Black Workers organisation in the Northwest and in Manchester in particular. Because there are so many stories of people facing discrimination at work. Just imagine, I suppose, not a nice analogy, but just imagine loads of little Farages and Tommy Robinsons in workplaces. That's what workers experience every day, black workers experienced every day in terms of their day-to-day existence, and from a supervisor in the health service to whatever. They can constantly be bullied and harassed in terms of the workplace. And therefore, like, tried to help them we've tried to collectivise that organisation, not as an end in itself, but as a way of trying to demand more from the trade union movement as a whole. You know, I'm active with my trade union branch as a whole, not just within black workers. And I suppose it's how we balance those two things. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are. How we balance both representing our own communities, our black communities, and what they're facing, but also trying to make that bigger cause within the wider trade union movement to fight back. Because often bureaucrats want us, well, they're happy to give me some money to do an event just for black workers, but they're not happy when I'm trying to reach out to their other workers to be part of that, to widen that struggle. So and forget to understand better. So I suppose that's kind of my question. And I think that's the demand we all have to make at the moment to make the movement stronger.
Thank you. Just at the back there in red. Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of reflect back to August and the riots that took place in August, because in Sheffield, by Wednesday, we actually got one of the mosques to move the prayer times and to come out in their clothing from the prayers to support one of the protests, and which was fantastic to see, really made a massive difference to people. But many of the mosques refuse to support the protests, although they have all said they have massive respect for Stand Up to Racism now, which is a major step forward. But what I found quite interesting is there was a very big group of young lads who turned out on the protests, They came with their hoods on because they were worried about the police. And to be honest, the police were more interested in them than they were in dealing with the fascists who were attacking the hotel in Rotherham. But one of them took his hood off and said, "Oh, hiya, Maxine," somebody who I'd worked with for quite a long while. And he said to me, "Our parents and our grandparents might have put up with this crap, but I'm not prepared to put up with it any longer." He said, how many years back do we have to go in terms of our being born in this country before they accept that we are British? And I thought that was absolutely fantastic that he'd said that. But I just wondered what your reflections were on how we really get more people from the Muslim community involved. I mean, we're quite good in Sheffield, really, but it is still difficult.
Thank you. I've got somebody else over here. Yep, that'll be yourself, and then down the front here.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to flesh out a little bit more, I suppose, the relationship between race, class, and community here, because I think, in a way, it's really important, and I think it's, the question that's just been raised really highlights that. And I think, when people talk about how, people in your families were telling you not to go on the protests in the summer, in my family, my mother was saying exactly the same things to me over the summer. She said exactly the same things to me 45 years ago as well, when I went on my very first anti-Nazi demonstration. She said exactly the same thing to me when I was an undergraduate student at Leeds University, straight after Jack the Ripper had been caught in '81, and we were having student protests of women demanding that the university take the question of security and safety of female students seriously. I think the point is that, so like, if you base yourselves just around community, although on the one hand, this can be an attractive thing to do. So when you were talking about how, people can go to mosques, we can go to gurdwaras, yes, it's really important to do these sorts of things. But I think part of the reason why the movement in the gurdwaras in the past was so politicized is precisely because they were based around genuine working class struggles of Punjabis that were organized politically around the Indian Workers Associations and the Pakistani Workers Associations and the Kashmiri Workers Associations. Class was something, and trade unionism was something that was fundamental. And yes, whilst they wanted to get everybody within the Asian community to be united against the racists, they also understood that that could not be the beginning and the end of the matter either, because you will always have people within the communities for a whole variety of reasons. Some like, mums and dads who are just genuinely fearful about their parents going off, their children going off and doing anything that they don't like, but also sometimes because there are fundamental political differences in terms of interests. And I think this is where class is really important, because, when you said earlier about how, you can have this Asian Punjabi employer that's paying pittance to a group of, Punjabi workers, etc. This is something that is replete in the whole history of the Indian subcontinent and what's going on today. People also sometimes they go on about how, today we heard from the first black woman that was elected as an MP, Diane Abbott, and it was a real privilege to have her here and speak in the way that she did. But at the end of the 19th century, we also had the election of black MPs, one of whom was elected for the Liberal Democratic Party, Dadabhai Naoroji, but another one, Boanagri, who was elected for the Tory party. He was elected for the Tory party in the 1890s, even though he came from a supposedly liberal background, as they say. Nevertheless, he supported the British Indian Empire. For his services to that, he was given the commander of the knighthood of the Indian Empire, which today is the CBE. And when it came to the 1926 general strike, surprise, surprise, he didn't support that strike. He argued that people had to cross the picket lines to break the strike. There was another Indian MP, I will sum up on this, who was elected a few years later, a man by the name of Sharpuji Saklatwala, who was elected for the Labour Party in Battersea, and he had a very different response to this. Because he was a socialist, he not only supported the 1926 general strike, but argued for workers to respect the picket line. So class is absolutely fundamental and can trump and does trump community. And I think that's quite important to recognise in this.
Thank you. So I've just got one person down here at the front, and then we'll just take this person down here as well. And then I think I'm going to get you both to come back because there's quite a lot.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the question of class solidarity, or the lack of it. I mean, the two strikes that have already been mentioned, I want sort of people to really take a bit more interest in, is the Red Scar Mill strike of 1965 in Preston. It was a huge strike, huge factory making the cords for tyres. And this was a strike where the management thought they could exploit the divisions, the night shift being Asian, the day shift being white, and use that to be able to get a 50% increase in the number of machines per worker by getting it the night shift, the Asian, not Asian actually, it was very much more mixed than that actually, workforce. And they just imposed it on them, basically, of which the reaction was to occupy the factory. They occupied it for 19 hours. They then went out and strike for another 3 weeks. They basically survived on the basis of community solidarity. They came to Manchester and places to actually collect support and so forth. There was almost no support from within. There was no support at all from within the union. There was very little support from within the white community. One socialist, comrade, got actively involved. When asked by the strike committee leader, who had just started the meeting by a little bit off the Quran, turned to him, and so he said, "Could you make your prayer?" So he says, "Our Father who art in heaven, make sure we win the strike." That was his thing. And I just feel it's very important. I mean, the same thing happens with Imperial typewriter dispute, where actually, the factory closes a year later without a fight, having, white workers having scabbed on a strike by Asian workers. And the price we pay for failing to recognize the class interests, it can be very high indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. So just down here at the front.
Hello, everyone. I founded an organisation called Indus Legacy a few years ago. I was the regional organiser for Stand Up to Racism in the Northeast as well. And I expected the riots to happen because I'd seen flashpoints of it happen before in Sunderland, and we had to deal with some of that violence on a much smaller scale. I just didn't know when it was going to happen. But I founded Indus Legacy, which is a South Asian collective, because I was aware that the South Asian community hadn't been mobilised to its full extent, especially within other anti-racist spaces or organizations or whatever it was. And there's very specific history, there's very specific cultural elements, there's very specific dynamics that happen within the South Asian community. And I think that's partly, kind of why we're involved with Asian Defiance as well, myself, Taj and Mukhtar. There are very specifics. Obviously, this doesn't mean that we organize completely separately, but we have a challenge even as Asians on the left to connect with a lot of our communities now as well. That in itself is a difficulty. Now, I thought I've got to leave soon because I've got to catch a train. I've come from Newcastle today. But I thought I may as well quickly speak about my experience in the riots, because I was there in Newcastle, Middlesbrough and Sunderland, and every single one of these cities was a different dynamic. And I wanted to speak a little bit about the range of sort of strategies and tactics that we need to use, because there was a lot of arguments happening even within our communities as well. And we've heard some of those sort of stories here today as well. And people were fearing to come out on the streets and things like that. But for example, in Sunderland, there was barely any of us. There was one mosque that was open. There was about 10 white students from Newcastle thought they were going to go down and do something against the full riot. And I thought I better go with them because they had no connections to the local community. Made connections with the mosque. Then 100 Bengali lads came out and we were ready to defend it. The safest place in that city was that mosque, the only mosque that was open. Middlesbrough, there was about 500 of us, Asian lads, stood outside one of the mosques. And both of these places, actually, in Sunderland and Middlesbrough, an argument broke out. In Sunderland, I think it was one of the imams or something was arguing with the community that you should all leave it and go home. And then some of the other lads were like, no, I'm going to bring my sons up now and we're going to bring everyone here. In Middlesbrough, a similar argument happened where there was about 500 of us. There were 6 police vans watching us, by the way, whilst the rest of the town was being smashed up. In Sunderland, buildings were being set on fire, cars were being set on fire. Same thing happened in Middlesbrough as well. And what we were watching was videos on Instagram, Twitter, whatever, TikTok and all that, of them literally booting people's front doors in and going into their houses. And then when we had us and then had that street, obviously, would have seen the videos, I had friends that were in that road where they were dragging people out if they weren't white, driving along that road and things like that, right? So we were watching these videos, and then you know, they're not exactly, you know, political activists or anything, but these are people, working class lads in the area. Some of them might have been involved in certain, you know, dodgier aspects of society or whatever it was. But at the end of the day, we saw that, and half of us split off, and we were like, we got to do something about it. Again, we were at the most well protected place probably in the country at that point. 500 Asian lads and 6 police riot vans watching that one mosque while everything else is being smashed up. So when we seen that, half of us split off, and there was those arguments taking place, that we went and chased them off the streets, and we went and had to fight them off the streets as well. And that's a very different dynamic to when then you get to Newcastle. By the time Newcastle came around, the far right had picked their first mobilization to be in the West End of Newcastle. Now, if you know the West End of Newcastle, that is the Asian area, basically, of Newcastle. We have pockets of diversity. 3,000 lads come out there, far right didn't even show up. Again, Saturday, then you had Stand Up to Racism mobilized on that one, and the whole community came out, and then the riots completely was turned on its head. But there's very different things there. And one last thing I want to just finish on.
Yeah, if I can just get you to sum up.
Yeah, just last point. In the Newcastle one, obviously I'm from a Hindu background. My family are Hindu nationalists, very right-wing, far-right, all that kind of thing, right? But I've been involved in anti-racist work for about 10 years now. Now, as a Hindu, I went down to these places and I went to defend the mosques and put my body and myself on the line for these kind of things. And in Newcastle, I took a group of mostly Asian lads, and we went around to every single temple in Newcastle. We went to the Hindu temple, and we, you know, went and made connections with the Gurudwara, with every single mosque in Newcastle as well together, to really make a statement and put that point across there. And I even had some of my family members who are very Hindu nationalists, but some of my family members were Hindu nationalists and also supported Tommy Robinson in the past. And they were texting me saying, you know what, I was wrong and you were right. My mum was scared to come out in the streets, and you stopped it from happening by organising in these cities. So that there is power in what we can do, and we can break down those divisions within our own communities as well by uniting.
Thank you very much. And that seems like a good moment to move on to some summaries from our speakers. Thank you to everybody who joined in. I know there were more people who wanted to join in the conversation, but we, as always, ran out of time. So I'm just going to ask both Mukhtar and then Taj to come back to answer some questions, but also to give their thoughts about where we're at with the state, the struggle today, and the way forwards from here.
Thank you. I think class is central. I think everything that's been talked about, the connection, the links between all of those things, from partition to the rise of communalism, all of those, only way to make sense of the world in which we live today is through a class analysis. Racism is an ideology, as far as what as young kids we understood was created to justify the plunder, the looting, the extraction of resources, our lands and our labor. It's a tool, as people said, to divide the working class, but it's also a tool to extract greater surplus from Asian, Afro-Caribbean, black peoples. And the struggle against racism has to be fought. We stood back in the 80s. It didn't really matter in the eyes of the racist. When one of our members was a doctor or a dentist, the race didn't differentiate on the basis of class. In their eyes, we were all niggers, wogs, and packies. And the fight back had to be based on class. And we've had Richie Sunak, we've had Obama. Capitalism will co-opt people of color into positions of power. Back then, Maggie Thatcher was a woman. Her becoming prime minister didn't alleviate the condition of women. Yorkshire Ripper was on the loose and he was murdering women. So class is fundamental. Udham Singh was mentioned. As young people, we used to paint banners, and each banner that we painted was dedicated to a freedom fighter. Udham Singh, when he was arrested and charged for killing General Dwyer for the massacre of Amritsar, he was asked what his name was. He said his name is Ram Muhammad Singh. He combined all the religions. So caste, racism, all these oppressions, all the exploitations are connected. They're integral part of a capitalist system that seeks to extract greater benefits, and they are the ones that lead to the crisis, and we pay the price. The situation that we're facing now is we have monsters in power. We look at what's happened over the pond with Trump, a convicted criminal, here a so-called former human rights lawyer that's supplying weapons for genocide in Israel. And then we see the most monstrous rise of the far right. and the ruling elite will allow the right to come into power to maintain their exploitative rule. And so class is very, very important. And the weapon to fight back has to be based upon building a united front. We have to mobilize every section of our community, irrespective of our color, our faith, our religion, reach into the villages, in the cities, in the town, to fight back against the far right. It's far worse than what it was back in the 80s. When we saw what happened in Middlesbrough, that was a pogrom. We didn't have that level of violence, right? So, we've set up, in response to that, in the aftermath, we set up Asian Defiance. The aim of that basically is to build a broad-based South Asian national movement that builds upon the traditions of the revolutionary struggles in the subcontinent, not only just fascism, but we also have the rise of popularism, we have the rise of communalism around the world, in Pakistan, in India, Modi and stuff, right? So we have to build unity within the South Asian communities. We have to challenge communalism, and our aim is to bring those veterans of the struggle together, young people together, and then not to be separate, but to contribute to stand up to racism as a united front. Our role is to mobilize our communities. And really important task is, let's not leave the working class to the fascists. There is austerity taking place. There's crime. There's a cost of living crisis taking place. They're presenting easy solutions. There's no hope in what they present. We are the forces of progression. We are the only people that can actually deal with the climate crisis. We can build equality and unity. We have to do that through a broad, united front. And that's what we will create to build, defeat them, as we've done back in history, put them in the dustbins of history and move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mukhtar. We're really honoured to have you here. And I'm going to hand over to Taj for the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to address a couple of themes that emerged from the questions. Firstly, the question of the mosques telling young people not to go out onto the streets. This is a thing we've always had in the communities, and Mukhtar will tell you that they had the same struggles with the Asian youth movements, and you had the community leader types who weren't really interested in the broader struggle, who would often try and limit the organizing capacity. I think often it comes from a genuine place of fear for children. And, my mum was in tears during the riots. She was worried about my safety as a journalist covering the riots. And my dad never wanted me to get involved in political activism because of his own memories of what it was like. And the thing is, you've got to have reform within communities. People forget Malcolm X was all about reforming his own community. Within our communities, we need to explain that the young people will always organize anyway. And if you don't provide them with the politics, if you don't provide them with the organizing capacity, then they can get themselves into very serious trouble. And we saw that in 2001 in Bradford and Burnley, where the young Asians were given disproportionate sentencing. So there is nothing in the religion, there is nothing within the culture that says you cannot organize to defend your communities. I have family in Middlesbrough, and they were telling me how the imam said, don't go out to defend the mosque, you'll get into trouble, leave it to the police. And when they saw one of the mosques get attacked, they came out, all of them came out. The uncles came out, the young people came out. Organizing self-defense is not an exercise in vigilantism, it's a conscious political action. And we had community leaders in Middlesbrough who were telling the young people, you're here to defend the mosques, you're here to defend the businesses, but don't get yourselves into trouble. And that's why we have to provide leadership in our communities. I think anti-racist organizing is not something that's going to happen over time. You have to find the right people with the clout in the community, with the connections, people who they will listen to. And it's the same principle in trade union organizing, finding the natural workplace leaders. That's a very strong and important task that we need to get involved in. I think the other crucial thing that we have to be involved with is monitoring. We have to monitor where the far right are, what messages they're using. That means going on Facebook groups. That means looking at the Telegram groups. That means actually going into white working class communities and providing an alternative. And I think it's very, very important that we differentiate between the hardcore fascists who have to be physically confronted and some of the older generation who've been misled, but also some of the younger generation who are being radicalized by the far right. Because at the end of the day, many of these people are our people. They are working class people. Some of them will be the grandchildren of people involved in the broader labor movement. and they've been misled by alt-right influencers of social media, Tommy Robinson, Andrew Tate. Even in the Black and Asian communities, we saw a shift, and we saw young people listening to these alt-right influencers. And so I think it's important that political education and monitoring are just as important as physical confrontations on the streets. It's not about calling people Nazis and going home. It's about challenging the Nazis, making them uncomfortable, and winning over the people influenced by their hate. That's our job. We are interested in building a mass movement. That involves all of us. And the calls of the anti-racist, the Asians, to the white left in the 80s was, you need to organize in your community, just like we organize in our community. We know that in Newcastle, we had white anti-racist colleagues who were infiltrating the far-right groups and providing insight into where they were going to go. And so we all have a role to play in the anti-racist struggle. I think that's very, very important. I think it's also important, and this is just my final point before I finish, that we map out where the far-right threat is. We have very big Black and Asian communities in Britain. We have very capable, organized communities in places like Luton, where I'm from, in Birmingham and in Bradford. But in the northeast, where you have more isolated Black and Asian communities, in Wales, in Belfast, in these places, they need our support and solidarity. And so I think it's really important that we are strategic in where we are organizing, and that even if we can outnumber the fascists in the big metropolitan cities, do not think that that hateful atmosphere has disappeared in those smaller communities where we are fewer in number. So that's also where we really need to start building up a presence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you for your amazing insights, and to people for participating in that. I've just got two announcements. The first one is, if there's an Archad Ibrahim here, we've got some lost property for you, so you need to find a steward. And then we've just got one final plenary. I hope people have found today a really valuable chance for our movement to come together and talk about the fight against racism and the far right. And the closing plenary will be happening as soon as you can get there in the main hall downstairs. So thank you once again to our speakers and to everyone who took part. Get yourself down to the main plenary, and then we'll get out after today and organise in our communities.